meet. Today, Sven is talking about a topic related to the which is within the field of the philosophy of time, and is related to some work already done and presented in this book. We also hope to have further discussion in the Q&A time. And of course, everyone is free to ask questions to our speaker at the end of his presentation. He's going to share his screen. So Sven, I leave it to you. And thank you very much again for accepting our invitation. You are officially inaugurating our series online.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I mean, that's a great opportunity. Let me just now share the screen. Okay, so much of our ordinary ways of thinking about time sort of presuppose a pre-relativistic conception of time and space. And that same is true also for many philosophical theories that have been advanced. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're sort of very old theories. Some of the theories I'm going to talk about have actually were conceived in the early 20s of the last century. And so at a time where the special relativity theory was already sort of being accepted by the physics community. And the central, so one can then conceive of relativistic physics as in a way posing a challenge to these traditional philosophical theories. And there are different ways of responding to this challenge. And what I want to explore here is a rather radical way of responding, namely by asking the question, so how could we refashion these traditional theories so as to arrive at theories that no longer presuppose a non-relativistic conception of space-time? I should warn you, I'm not going to give arguments in favor of these views. So there's, in a way, little by way of philosophical argument. What I'm more concerned with is to explore the logical space and see what kinds of positions we can propose as relativistic counterparts to these traditional views. And secondly, I should warn you that I'm not a philosopher of science, let alone a physicist. So I'm just I'm happy to receive criticism on that front as well, if I get anything wrong. But I hope that I don't, to the extent that I foray into the area of physics at all. Okay, so here's the plan. So first I want to say something about the role that sentential operators and temporal, and as we will see later, spatial temporal operators play in ontology. In particular, how their use interacts with quantification and so with claims about existence. Then I will talk about, introduce the traditional metaphysical views on time and existence that are the most prominent ones. There I will it will be semi-formal because I will try to capture these different views by a limited number of principles. And to present them in this condensed way, it will be necessary to use some formalism. Also, that will help us then to see more clearly the parallels and differences with regard to the counterpart theories that are relativistic. Then I will present the relativistic challenge, and as I said, then turn to a novel way or a more radical way of responding to that challenge. And that will have three parts. I will try to motivate these this radical refashioning. In particular, I want to pay attention to the fact to what extent the original motivation one might have for the traditional views survives this relativistic turn. And then I will sort of present these counterparts to the traditional theories, and at last I will sort of address a challenge to some of those views. Okay, so let's begin with the preliminaries and say something about operators. Sentential operators are a means to avoid or cancel ontological commitments. So here's an example from the fact that Rudy Giuliano believes that there exists a burned batch of ballots. It neither follows that there exists a burned batch of ballots, nor that there exists something of which Rudy believes that it is a burned batch of ballots. So prefixing the relevant clause by the operator Rudy believes that allows us to avoid or cancel any such ontological commitments. And that means, that illustrates that not all of these sentential operators are factive. So imply that sort of a statement with that operator in front doesn't imply the truth of what it is in front of. And not all operators underwrite the so-called Barkan formula. And I display that where O is the operator and you see the existential quantification. I will illustrate that formula with an example in a minute. But definitely Rudy believes that is a good example that shows that that formula will then break down for this replacement of O. So while that is a good example, it's of little philosophical interest, of course. But that's not true of other operators. So for example, possibly or sometimes, and I will focus on sometimes here. So sometimes clearly isn't factive. That it sometimes rains doesn't imply that it rains, fortunately. And it's also a matter of controversy whether sometimes underwrites the Barkan formula. So whether from the fact that sometimes there is a phi, it follows that there is something that sometimes is a phi. And that's sort of a controversial claim. Now, so far I've just sort of talked about sort of the relation between existence and operators and the order in which you sort of quantify or you put the operator, and that makes a difference or it doesn't, depending on the view you take. But I just want to highlight that it's also controversial to think that our talk about sometimes, which is sort of an operator, just sort of like a modal adverbial construction, sometimes comma, and then there comes a sentence. It's controversial whether that can be analyzed in terms of there being a time at which, right? So this principle here, hash, is controversial, and I want to illustrate why that is, or how one can see that it's controversial. So consider the following presentist position. I will say more about presentism later. This position about the present time. So here are three claims. The present time tau exists, but no time distinct from tau exists, yet sometimes a time distinct from tau exists. So on the face of it, that position seems coherent. But if we assume this principle hash from the previous page at the bottom, the third claim here of this little mini theory would yield that there is a time t such that at t a time distinct from tau exists. Now the first two claims of the mini theory imply that the only such time would have to be tau itself. Yet uncontroversially, if at the present time something's the case, then it's the case. So we would have, it would then have to be the case that there is after all a time distinct from tau, and that leads to a contradiction. Are you still there?
Yes.
Yes,
okay,
yes,
sorry,
yes.
because the image disappeared, so that's why I'm asking. Okay, and I can't move any longer. What is happening? Yeah, okay, here we go. Okay, so that's just as a sort of preliminary consideration about the role of these temporal operators, and I use the example of sometimes, but there are others. And we can see now what other operators there are. In order to discuss these views, we need to assume sort of a tensed language, and we will also sort of use some sort of logical machinery And the way to proceed here, I suggest, is to take two primitive temporal operators, namely H and G, and H is sort of, it has always been the case that, and G is, it will always be the case that, or alternatively, always in the past and always in the future. So we take them as primitive, and then we can define a host of other operators. For example, sometimes in the past, which is sort of the dual of H, or sometimes in the future, that's the dual of G. And we can also go on then to explain what we mean by always and sometimes. So always in particular, so that merits sort of a mention. That is just the conjunction of, so always, to say always P is just to say P is the case, or presently the case, has always been the case, and is always going to be the case. And sometimes then it's just the dual of always. So that's sort of a basic set of temporal operators that would be helpful in articulating the traditional views in question. And we extend this basically to include operators of the form at t. So at time t, so the t stands for time. Now, intuitively, although I'm not going to use the notion of being present here, intuitively, at TP is a statement that holds just in case whenever t is present, p, right? So always if t is present, then p. And understood in this way, it's clear that a statement of the form at TP doesn't entail that t exists, because just look at the intuitive sort of equivalent that shows clearly that there is no commitment to the existence of t. Okay, so that's just, maybe that's sort of already a mouthful for you guys, because it's sort of, it looks sort of semi-technical, but basically it's just a way of capturing certain temporal qualifications that we also make in ordinary language, and sort of to regiment that a little. So now I would want to characterize the traditional views by a limited number of principles, and all these principles you should read as if all the free variables are close by universal quantifier, and the principles themselves are, as it were, always. They always hold. Well, why is that? Well, because metaphysical theories don't come with a sell-by date. So it's not as if the presentist only wants to say something that's true today. They want to say something that always holds whenever a given time is present. And I will use sort of a little predicate here for existence. That's sort of written E with an exclamation mark. That just abbreviates existence, and we can define that actually using quantification. So you see that on the page. To exist is to be something, basically. There's sort of no mystery here, what we mean by existence. Then the so-called permanentist view holds that what exists will always in the future exist, and what exists has always in the past existed. You can see, so if you are confused by these formula, you can just look at the stuff in italics as we go along. So that gives you the intuitive content of these principles. Right, so you can see that permanentism, given that what exists presently exists, so that's sort of trivial, you get to the view that always everything always exists. Right, also once we heed what I said before, that we have to prefix all this by universal quantifiers and then always, then that's what you get. And that basically expresses that there is no variation across time, variation in what exists. So ontology stays fixed across time. The contrasting temporarist thesis is sometimes something sometimes doesn't exist. So that's just the direct negation of the permanentist claim. And we can distinguish, in this camp of views, we can sort of distinguish between two very well-known or prominent metaphysical theories, Presentism and the growing block. And in order to express them in this neat fashion, let us use a predicate for being a time. So that's our t. So then presentism can be represented, and I will show why and how that delivers what we might ordinarily expect presentists to say, can be captured by these two principles. I get a request here. What is that? Sergio sent me.
Sorry, it was me. I was trying just to move the controls.
Okay, so I ignore that.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Good. So the presentist then says that at any time, that time never existed before. So is new in that respect. And the second principle, B2, says at any time, that time is obsolescent. Well, that's sort of my way of capturing that. At any time, that time will never again in the future exist. So it's about to die, as it were. The growing block theory takes one of these principles from presentism, but takes another principle from permanentism. So it still has that at any time the time is new, so never existed before, but it, instead of the B2 principle, it has a one, what exists will always in the future exist. And I will sort of explain why that is sort of the intuitive, sort of why that captures what the image that the growing block suggests. Let's look at presentism first. So we have these two principles. I will now make certain claims about what's derivable and what's not. We can go back to that, but just sort of take my word for it that this works. So we have two background assumptions. At any time, that time exists. So that seems trivial. And then whenever t precedes t prime, then if at t, at the earlier time, p is the case, then at the later time, it's the case that p used to be the case. And if at the later time p is the case, then at the earlier time, it was the case that it would be the case in the future, that p. And against the backdrop of these two assumptions, the two claims that I identified as the key claims of presentism jointly entail that at any time t is the only time that exists. Okay, so far, so good. But presentism, that's normally sort of expressed by saying, well, everything is present. Whatever is in time is present. How do we get to that? Well, things in time are, so unlike numbers, let's say, are whenever they exist, located at some time that exists. Always some time exists. At any time, t is the present time. And if you have all that, then the combination of B1, B2 just gives you what you would ordinarily expect the presentist's key claim to be. Namely, always there exists one and only one time, and that time is present, and everything in time is located at it. Where the always here takes wide scope of all the rest that comes after that. Okay, so that is then sort of captures neatly presentism. The growing block theory, so what's the image there? So reality grows and grows, so sort of more comes to be, but there's sort of, the future does not yet exist, but sort of new layers are added as time goes by. So B1 captures the intuition that always some new time slice is added to reality, where the time of its addition coincides with its temporal location. A1 captures the intuition that nothing will ever be lost in the process. So A1 says that what exists will always in the future exist, will continue to exist. Given that distinct times are earlier or later than one another, B1 also implies that at no time t is there any time later than it. Right? And that's exactly, so you have this edge of becoming, and nothing later than it, than the edge exists. So that's exactly the kind of view. Okay, and I have a little consideration here why that follows. Good. now we have these two views on the table. Let me just add briefly that in the rare scenario in which at present time itself has just begun and has just ended, so it's just sort of, that was it. It's just one time slice that reality consists of. Then any claims of the form always in the past and always in the future will be vacuously true. And if that is so, then all these principles hold trivially. And then the distinction between these three views, permanentism, presentism, and the growing block, collapses. So we have to make some background assumption, namely that there's sort of that time sort of at least extends to two times, as it were, as sort of the universe lasts at least sort of for 2 moments, and we can express that by just saying that let T be any tautology, that sometimes it holds that sometimes in the future that tautology holds. So that is a way of capturing within this regimented tensed language what it is for time not just to have begun and just ended. Okay, let me turn to the relativistic challenge now. This conceptual framework so far presupposes that it makes sense to speak of the absolute simultaneity of distinct point events, provided only that at any given time the tense truths are truths simpliciter and so not subject to any further relativization, for example, frames of reference. And if one's ontological view, if correct, can only be expressed by tense truths, one must regard such tense truths as truths simpliciter, because existence isn't relative to anything else. So given that, now let X and Y be any 2 point events, whether they're distinct or not, doesn't matter, then we can actually define absolute simultaneity as follows. X is absolutely simultaneous with Y, just in case sometimes both X and Y occur, where that just means either they presently both occur, in the past both occur, or in the future both occur. As a matter of fact, in all the formal models for tensed languages, not all of them, so I should say in most of them, it's assumed that the precedence relation defines an absolute and total order over the context of evaluation, which are sort of the abstract times that you find in the model theory. So that's another way of saying that for all T and T prime, either T and T prime are identical, or one precedes the other, or the other way around, right? So that's basically, that's for example, a condition that's flouted when you go for branching time conception. So they do exist, of course, these conceptions, but here we are just working now with the linear theories. So the temporal structure looks roughly like this, where the points on the marked out horizontal correspond to all the points located at the point events located at the present time. They are absolutely simultaneous with one another, and sort of I used a line instead of just a point to illustrate that they may be spatially separated. And each horizontal, so if you just sort of, I've marked out one, but you can sort of think of parallel lines here. Each horizontal in the structure corresponds to an abstract time. So then you can see that we have this absolute and total order. Either these times are identical or one precedes the other. By contrast, in relativistic space-time, things look rather different. We have this structure of space-time. So we have a fourfold classification of, we have basically 5 different regions, as it were. So the here now, which is just a space-time point, the causal future, the causal past, and the elsewhere region. Sorry, 4. That's why elsewhere stands left and right. So you have to think of the bow tie as the elsewhere region. And so here are some comments on that. The causal chains of events, so-called word lines, that pass through the here now, proceed from the causal past to the causal future. And any space-time point in the past then precedes, in some determinate sense, the here now, and any space-time in the future succeeds, in a precise and absolute sense, the here now. The elsewhere region, so that bow tie, comprises all space-time points merely spatially separated from the here now. And you can see then, given that there are points in the elsewhere region, there is no absolute and total temporal order. There are distinct points that are not later or earlier than one another. The relativistic challenge now to traditional views is that relativistic space-time doesn't underwrite any notion of absolute simultaneity between distinct point events and no absolute and total temporal order either. And so, as I said at the beginning, there are different ways of responding to this, but I don't think that the standard replies on behalf of the traditional metaphysical theories, namely those replies that sort of try to preserve those theories, that I don't think that they are very persuasive. So, for example, it can't be taken for granted that metaphysics provides a deeper or better insight into the structure of reality than the best of our current physics. The epistemic possibility, so it might turn out, well, the epistemic possibility that relativistic physics be someday overthrown and an absolute and total temporal order be restored, doesn't seem to me to issue a license now to ignore the physics and stick with traditional metaphysics instead. And there's no reason to think that relativistic physics leaves room for such an absolute and total temporal order, as it questions the physical basis of the very notion of absolute simultaneity that would help divide the elsewhere region into earlier and later. So you just sort of draw your horizontals again through the here now. So what to do now? And so here I want now to contemplate and explore the possibility of giving a radical response and say, well, why not exchange the view that ontology varies, if at all, across time, for the view that ontology varies, if it ever does, across space-time. So why would that be of interest? Well, suppose that before one learns anything about relativity, one accepts some form of temporary. So one is a presentist or one is a growing blocker. So one thinks that what exists varies across time. And then one is prone to denying that what exists also varies across space for the following reason. A mere spatial change only takes one to a place absolutely simultaneous with a departure point. And so from a temporariist perspective, no change in what exists will be involved. But now suppose you learn about relativistic physics for the first time and you learn that there is no physical basis for absolute simultaneity between spatially separated points. Then one has to ask oneself afresh what objections to ontological variation across space remain. If you start off as a temporarist, that is. So here's now sort of a way of illustrating that further, and I will focus on the growing block because that's the kind of theory I've worked on most. So pre-relativistically, a proponent of the growing block may give a causal interpretation of their view. And here's a first one. We'll soon see a second one. So here's the idea. What now exists is exhausted by what happens now and by whatever conspired to make or let it happen. So what exists is located somewhere in a network of causal chains, culminating in what happens now. Suppose that's your view that pre-relativistically you start off with. Variation in what exists upstream or downstream of such causal chains is already contemplated by your view, because you think of this as a line. Basically, there's only one path that causal chains can possibly take. Now, upon learning about relativistic space-time, it then comes as a surprise that now, the term now, refers, if to anything, to the here now, that's a space-time point, and that what one excluded from one's ontology, given that criterion, were not just things located beyond the culmination point, so what's in the causal future, but also things located in a hitherto unacknowledged region, the bow tie, that is neither upstream nor downstream of those causal chains. And one also realizes by just thinking about what the space-time structure looks when a point in the elsewhere region is taken as the here now, one also comes to recognize that one's own criterion of existence implies that there's variation in what exists across the elsewhere region. Now, why should these findings automatically force one to abandon the criterion with which one started? Here's another interpretation. What now exists is exhausted by what happens now, and whatever has the potential to conspire to make or let happen what has not yet occurred. That's to say, what exists is located somewhere in a network of causal chains that are going to culminate beyond now and what has not yet happened. In short, what exists is what has the causal potential to shape the future. Now again, variation in what exists upstream or downstreams of such causal chains is already contemplated by one's view. And upon learning about relativistic space-time, it then comes as a surprise that now refers, if to anything, to the here now, space-time point, and that one has included in one's ontology things with the potential to causally affect what's going to happen in the distant future without causally affecting anything that's going to happen in the immediate future. And such things markedly differ from what happens at the here now. So just think about the space-time structure again. So take a point in the elsewhere region. There is a causal chain passing through that point that will get into your the absolute future of the here now. So it will affect the distant past. It doesn't go through what happens at the here now, though. It doesn't go. It doesn't sort of take the step that anything what happens at the here now can take causally to affect the future, because of course the here now is at the tip of the future light cone. So one thereby realizes that there is a region neither upstream nor downstream of causal chains passing through the here now, and that one's criterion of existence implies that there's also variation in what exists across that elsewhere region. Again, sort of the question is, why should that be enough to, why should that force one rationally to abandon one's original criterion? So there are stories to be told where all of a sudden the kinds of claims that one used to make about time in the pre-relativistic setting may sort of motivate a congenial view in the relativistic setting. Okay, here now sort of let's get to the counterpart theories. That gets a bit ugly, I admit, because we now need a new language and we need a new logic, because our old tense language and our old temporal logic simply won't do. So I've tried to sort of use operators that sort of, in a way, are reminiscent of the kind of diagram of relativistic space-time. So you get everywhere in the causal past as sort of the black triangular with the tip up. That corresponds basically to everything in the past light cone, and then similarly for the others. The everywhere elsewhere, sort of that is, I didn't put the bow tie, but that should actually be a bow tie. So you now have, instead of the temporal operator, spatio-temporal operators, right? Because the setting has changed. You now talk about regions of space-time, not segments on a timeline where the present is here and then sort of the line extends into the past and future, and that's it, because you now have sort of other regions to take care of. And then we can also define everywhere, which is sort of like the definition of always, just a conjunction of claims, this time of 4 claims. Okay, now we can, as before, distinguish between 2 main camps, spatial permanentism everywhere, everything, everywhere exists, and the negation of that, somewhere, something, somewhere doesn't exist. So somewhere and everywhere, this is really just talking about now about space-time. And spatial permanentism is basically sort of just another way of saying, well, there is no ontological variation, right? So that's, for the permanentist, the step is sort of immediate. The ontology is fixed, so in particular, it doesn't vary across space-time. Spatial temporarism comes again in different varieties. So we can describe them again in terms of principles. I said before that in the other setting, in the pre-relativistic setting, all the claims of the theory should be presented as holding always. So here now, analogously, they should be presented as holding everywhere. The truth of metaphysical theory doesn't depend on one spatial temporal location. So spatial permanentism then sort of just has now three claims because we have three different regions to talk about. It says that what exists everywhere in the causal future, in the causal past, and everywhere elsewhere. So that's straightforward. Now let's, instead of the time predicate, we have sort of a predicate S, short for is a space-time point. And then spatial presentism says that at any point, that point is new. Again, sort of the same idea. It never existed in its own past light cone. And at any point, that point is obsolescent. It's not going to continue to exist in the future. And relativistic GBT then sort of takes again sort of the first claim from spatial presentism, but then adds that what exists everywhere in the causal future because nothing is ever lost, basically. So there is nothing that falls away. That was the original idea of the growing block, or one of them. Okay, but these two views, as you can see, they're just, we saw that spatial permanentism had three claims now because you have to say something about the elsewhere region. These two views so far are silent on what they want to say about the elsewhere region. And there are basically two options here for either type of view. There are now two options. One says that no point exists in its own elsewhere region. So that's the first principle, B3R. Or one says that what exists everywhere. So that's a claim that spatial permanentists also make. Okay, now I sort of want to illustrate these different views. So you have pointy spatial presentism. I have here sort of the glow around the here now, just sort of supposed to highlight the here now. That's where the locus of existence is, and that's it. So you have these three principles. They look sort of, they're structurally the same. They just concern either the absolute past, the absolute future, or the elsewhere region. So to see how this works, let X be any space-time point distinct from the here now. Trivially, at X exists. And it follows from these principles 1 to 3 that X doesn't exist at the here now. So at the here now is the only space-time point that exists. So that's what you get if you say that about the elsewhere region as a spatial presentist. But you might also say something else. And that's sort of the bow tie version. Again, sort of I've marked out sort of the regions that are populated, as it were. So that's the colored ones. Now you have sort of the same first principles about the past and the future. They are empty, as you can see, and now another claim about the elsewhere region. So how does that pan out? Now let X be any space-time point in the past or future of the here now. Right? Trivially, at X exists. And it follows then from the first two principles that X doesn't exist at the here now. because the here now is in the future or past of X. Right, so that's exactly why these regions, the future and the past light sort of are not populated, as it were. Now let X alternative be any space-time point in the elsewhere region of the here now. Trivially again, at X, X exists. By the third principle, it also exists throughout the elsewhere region of X. Right? That's what A3 then says. So if at X exists, then X also exists in the elsewhere region of X. Now, the relation of being in the elsewhere region of is symmetric. So, which is to say, if A is in the elsewhere region of B, then B is in the elsewhere region of A. So at the here now, then X2 exists. So basically, that's why if you look at what your ontology contains at the here now, it includes whatever populates the elsewhere region of the here now. So now you can make the similar distinction between different versions of relativistic growing block theories. So here now, you now have this kind of diagram, and it results basically, it's legitimized, this kind of coloring by the three claims that characterize this pointy version. So let X be any space-time point in the past of the here now, right? At X itself exists, trivial. By the first principle, X also exists throughout the future of X. And so X exists at the here now, because the here now is in the future of X. Alternatively, let X be any space-time point in the future or the elsewhere region of the here now. At X exists, but by the principles B1R and B3R, X exists nowhere in the past or elsewhere region of X. But the here now is in the past or elsewhere region of X. So at the here now, X doesn't exist. So that's why both, not only sort of the future is empty, so is the elsewhere region. Then you have the bow tie version of relativistic GPT, where you now include, unlike before, there you had only the here now and the past populated, you now have also the elsewhere region populated. And so again, we have sort of three principles, and let me quickly take you through that again. So let X be any point. So we are again asking, so what exists at the here now, right? So let X be any point in the past of the here now. Again, at X exists. By the first principle, X also exists throughout the future of X. And so X exists at the here now. Done. So that's why the past is colored here. Let X be any point in the future of the here now. Again, at X exists. By the first B principle, X exists nowhere in the past of X. But since the here now is in the past of X, at the here now, X doesn't exist. So that's why the future is not populated. And lastly, let X be any point in the elsewhere region of the here now. At X exists. By A3R, X exists everywhere in the elsewhere region of X. But since the here now is in the elsewhere region of X, at the here now, X2 exists. So that's why the elsewhere region is populated. Okay, so these are the different views that you might construe using this spatial temporal logic and language, and that sort of capture part of the original motivation or part of the original way of thinking about time but they say more about the elsewhere region that they didn't have anything to say about before, because that was just not forthcoming in the pre-relativistic setting. Okay, let me now lastly turn to a challenge that you might have. So this challenge is a challenge. There are many challenges, so I'm not defending any of these views, but I want to focus on one particular challenge that affects all the bow tie views. So all those views that, of the four I've characterized, that think that there's sort of that the future is empty, but the bow tie is populated. Okay, so now here is an example. Bow tie views do accept that among the things that exist at the here now, there are also points in the elsewhere region of the here now. So if we're now looking at the here now and ask ourselves what exists, then given the diagram, S2 and S1 both exist. All right? So far, so good. Now, the example already illustrates that being a point in the elsewhere region of is not a transitive relation. So, the here now is in the elsewhere region of S2. S1 is in the elsewhere region of the here now, but it doesn't follow that S1 is in the elsewhere region of S2. No, it's in the future of S2. If you contrast that with how we think about things in the pre-relativistic setting, on anyone's view, whether you are a temporarist or a permanentist, being a time in the present of is a transitive relation. So there's a contrast here, right? But that has nothing to do yet with the kind of view that the views that are being attacked here. That's just sort of a structural feature of this relativistic space-time. So, but now comes the problem. Consider the following transitivity principle. If a point exists at which something else exists, then that something else exists. So formally, if X exists and at X, Y exists, then Y exists. So basically, whatever you recognize as a point, whatever exists from the viewpoint of that point also exists from your point of view. And that seems sort of intuitively plausible, perhaps. However, we should sort of be careful here, because in the relativistic setting, our intuitions often give out. And you can now construct an argument against the bow tie views, assuming that principle, right? So at S2, the here now exists because the here now is in the elsewhere region of S2. And according to bow tie views, the elsewhere regions, whatever is there, sort of still feeds into one's ontology. At the here now, S1 exists because S1 is in the elsewhere region of the here now. If you now assume this transitivity principle, it follows that at S2, S1 likewise exists. Just assume that you are using the principle at S2. So you are at S2, and now you ask yourself, oh, so what follows? Well, you have to conclude, given the foregoing and the principle, that S1 exists. However, S1 is in the future of S2, and so given the kinds of views under consideration, at S2, S doesn't exist, so we have a contradiction. So something has to give. And of course, sort of the challenge by Putnam and others is precisely, oh, well, these bow tie views are sort of crap, but it's not clear why one must conclude that. So look again at that principle. in the pre-relativistic setting, on anyone's view, whether one is a temporarist or a permanentist, one accepts that being a time that exists at is a transitive relation. And now, what this principle requires us to concede is that being a space-time point that exists at is likewise a transitive relation. And the question is just why should one be, so how could one be pressured to accept that? Or what are the reasons why it's inevitable that we are sort of settled with this principle, so that two of the four views I've characterized are out of the window right from the start. And I think that what I said before, by way of motivating relativistic growing block theories, at least sort of on one of the interpretations that I offered, you have a good reason for resisting the transitivity principle. So recall that interpretation according to which what exists at a given point is located somewhere in a network of causal chains that will culminate beyond that point in what at that point has not yet happened. So in other words, what exists, what has the causal potential to shape the future of the here now. Now, from the perspective of the here now, if you just look at the diagram again, both S1, S2 are located in such a network, because of course there are sort of causal chains going through S2 or S1 that end up in the future of the here now. So in that sense, they can influence the shape that the future of the here now takes. Similarly, from the perspective of S2, the here now can do that. Right? There may be from the perspective of S2, there are causal chains passing through the here now that end up in the future of S2, and so can influence what the future of S2 looks like. But from the perspective of S2, S1 is not located in such a network. Right? S1 is in the future of S2. So it can't itself be something that causally responsible for the shaping of the future. So that's basically what someone who has this causal interpretation in mind is anyway committed to. And in fact, sort of, it's no surprise that sort of this kind of conclusion is being reached here, because what at the here now hasn't happened yet just doesn't coincide with what at S2 hasn't happened yet. The future light cones of these points simply don't coincide. So if you are sort of motivated by this way of thinking, and I'm not giving any reasons for endorsing that view or endorsing that interpretation, but if you are motivated in accepting the non-relativistic growing block theory because you have this sort of idea that what's real is really that which can causally influence the future, has the potential to do that. And if you then think, okay, so I now learn about relativity theory, so I accept the same thing, and now I have to say more, so I have to accept, for example, that there are things in the elsewhere region, because they too have this causal potential. If you are in that kind of mindset, then you will not be impressed by this transitivity principle. You will just reject it, and you will have a good reason, sorry, insofar as your position is motivated, and there are sort of reasons that speak in its favor, then there are eo ipso reasons for rejecting the transitivity principle. So at least sort of there's no knockdown argument that you can extract from Putnam's writings or Savitz's writings that would immediately sort of tell you that two of the contenders are definitely have to be relegated to the scrap heap. Okay, so that's all I have to say today. I'm a little bit under 1 hour, but yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sven.
Thank you.
So, well, thank you very much for this exhaustive presentation. I think that we have time for Q&A now. I would kindly ask you to raise your hand. Yes, Federico.
Yes, thank you, Sven, for this talk. It was very interesting to hear it from you. I think I have mainly two questions. One is of clarification, and the other is more general. The clarification question, if you can go to slide 22. I think I did not get when you are explaining what is the challenge that the denial of absolute simultaneity of relativity, what is the challenge that this poses to growing block. You also consider the case in which we are assuming that what exists is also what has the potential to cause something in the present, right? So, and then you say that the problem that this poses is that we are including in the ontology things that have the potential to causally affect what is going to happen in a distant future, but are not going to affect what is going to happen in the immediate future. So this is not clear to me from the
I'm just
from the
failing a whiteboard. I'm trying now to do this with paper. So, can you see this? I don't see myself, so I don't know whether that's visible. No?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. So basically the idea is that if sort of the way in which what happens at the here now can influence the future, that has to go through the immediate future to the more distant future. But there may be things happening here or closer to here that affect so at least that's anyway what I wanted to express by immediate and distant. Basically, it's not going, there's no, here the causal chains go like this, right? Mm-hmm. Here it immediately can affect this without having any influence on what goes on here. Whether that's really properly described as this being distant, this immediate, well, that depends on what line you take on sort of how you conceive of this. So maybe there's also the immediate future, right?
Okay, but these things that are in the alpha region are excluded from the ontology of the growing block theorist. Until so if these things cannot affect the present, they are excluded from the ontology, right?
No, but according to this criterion, all that matters is that you can causally affect the future.
Okay.
And then you realize that, yeah, before that you didn't even take into account any of this because you thought just, okay, there's the present. Of course, you thought that the present was extended spatially, never mind, but you just thought, okay, so you didn't even have to reflect on this. And now you learn that there is this region and that it also can influence the future, your future. and then it's all of a sudden more inclusive. What your criterion sort of deems as belonging to ontology, all of a sudden sort of, why don't these things populating this region don't qualify?
Okay, so I think my following question will be why the growing block theory need to a criterion that is so large. So why the growing block theorists cannot simply assume that what exists is what can causally affect the present?
Well, I mean, so first of all, so of course there may be other interpretations you might give or other motivations you might have for endorsing, pre-relativistically endorsing the growing block theory. But it would anyway be an odd criterion because the growing blocker, of course, will include the present, and the present doesn't causally affect itself. I mean, that would be a weird way of thinking. So that would just say well, only the past is real, basically. And that's not what traditional growing blockers would want to say. But I'm happy to concede that there may be all sorts of other stories you might tell why you want to be, why you think it's attractive to endorse the growing block theory. In a way, I haven't really engaged in that debate properly. All I've done is, oh look, but you may have thought that. And if you thought that, then why should you all of a sudden abandon that once you learn about relativistic physics?
Okay, thank you. If I have still one minute, I will also make my more general question, but here I think I need some help from physicists. For what I can recall, many philosophers of physics actually don't consider the denial of absolute simultaneity a problem, because they say, oh look, if we consider the standard model in cosmology and an expanding universe, we can somehow select a preferred frame of reference that let us define an absolute order of past, present, and future, at least on the cosmological scale. So I wondered if you consider this possibility, or if it's of interest for you.
Yeah. So okay. And here it's again vital to point out that I'm not a philosopher of science, let alone a proper scientist, physicist. So my knowledge is limited. I'm aware that, for example, some of the people who defend the traditional views have posited such a privileged frame of reference or foliation. So Dean Zimmerman, for example, explores that. It may well be sort of, okay, so what the empirical results will be, who knows? Or maybe there are these models and then there are reasons for really thinking that, physical reasons for thinking that there is this privileged foliation. Let that be so. Then of course you will be able sort of to recover the traditional sort of conception of time, because then you really have some hard facts that sort of select that kind of foliation. I'm fine with that. I was operating under the sort of assumption that that's not forthcoming. What then? So it's more like as long as that. So I mean, I know that there's stuff about quantum gravity. Honestly, I'm ignorant of this, but I was just thinking, well, if the structure is like that and nothing more, so if there is no privileged foliation, that's just all you have by way of space-time geometry, what physical geometry, what then can we do as philosophers who've so far engaged in these debates? Presentism, yes or no? Growing block, yes or no? What's the takeaway lesson then? If things pan out more favorably with respect to the traditional views, that's fine. What I wanted to insist, though, is that sort of we can't just pretend nothing has happened in the vague, or maybe not vague, but in sort of in the hope that this kind of privileging will occur at some point.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And now it's Giuliano's. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, can you see me and hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, that's so thanks for the talk. That's just like a general worry. So I was wondering whether the kind of principle that you use to then expand the theory to in the relativistic framework, maybe the causal efficacy, let's call it like that. So it's so it sounds like a principle that as a verificationist taste, you know, something that a verificationist would like to endorse, right? And that might be a bit in tension with one of the idea that in those traditional theory we have, all but possibly the B theory, namely that there are certain temporal properties that are that we can think of them as reality, having or not having them in some absolute sense. So the traditional theory that is like, for instance, presentness. Okay, there's a matter of fact about what is present, that it's is independent on, for instance, where I happen to be in time or things like that. Of course, where I happen to be in time might depend on where presentness is, but that's another story. And that's okay. That idea seems in tension with the verificationist thing. But then this tension seems to me that it's exploding in a way in when you bring together. So when you elaborate the thing in the relativistic setting, because then it looks like that there's no. So the only fact of the matter with respect to where these important temporal properties, whether they are instantiated or not, is always relative to a specific here and now. So that's probably just another way to say that the fact that the transitivity fails might be okay from the point of view of the principle that you endorse, but insofar as this principle is a verificationist principle, I mean, you want to have this absolute way of talking, and when you move to the relativistic setting, your way of talking is no longer absolute; it's just to relativize, although implicitly, to here and now. Sorry, is it clear more or less what I can elaborate more?
So there are several things I want to say in reply. Yeah. So first of all, I'm not really sure why. So there may be all sorts of things wrong with the causal criterion. I mean, I'm not sort of denying that there might be sort of pitfalls that I've sort of overlooked. But what I don't see is why that criterion is verificationist, because it still talks about causal potential. Well, yes, that of course will differ depending on where you are in space-time. So in that sense, it's relative. But then being present, well, whether a given time is present also depends on what time it is. So I don't see, so that may be an objective property, but whether it's instantiated by a given time depends on what time it is. So at that time, it's instantiated. Good. But then I can equally well say, there are these hard facts about causal potentials or causal efficacy. they're nothing about verification, and that's the first sort of question I have about your question. And the second thing is that's just as relative or tied to a certain point of evaluation as you have that in when you talk about the objective property of presentness being instantiated, because that will be true at one point, but not true at another.
Well, but you can, in the non-relativistic case, you can say like you can think that your your present distribution are relativized to your here and now, but nonetheless, the matter of facts are not relativized to here and now, are just like so there is a matter of fact in which time is some non-local notion, but it's like a so basically it's not relativized to the here, okay, with respect to what is present, whereas in that version you always have to so you can't say that something is outside the year of your now is present in the same absolute sense.
So let me just say what I intended to do, right? I intended to do it. So take your preferred story about time in the non-relativistic setting. So you have your presentism, and you say, well, okay, so now there is things change with time. What exists changes with time. What's present changes with time. Still, at each point, you say, well, there's a fact, namely here, that certain things are present. That's a hard fact. That's not a relative fact.
Yeah.
So similarly, why can't I say, so all I wanted to do was to say, well, okay, now transpose that talk, that kind of talk, by just changing the points of evaluation. So you no longer talk about times, you talk about space-time points. Right?
Yeah.
It's just the same. It's just now four-dimensional, if you like, and not just the temporal dimension. But there's no added relativity. So I've done all that you do in your pre-relativistic setting. Now I've done that. When you talk about times, I talk about space-time points. So how come that all of a sudden some relativity enters that wasn't there before? You might think that I'm talking about the future of a point. If that's what worries you, then let's just drop that and just say, well, what can shape the absolute future? Now, if I say that is just as the future in the pre-relativistic setting, that's an expression that will change its content depending on when you use it, right? Or will sort of its truth maker that will differ depending on where you speak, when you speak. So similarly here, when I just talk about what can affect the future, that's then now not a time-sensitive expression, that's now a space-time sensitive expression. But it has just the same trappings as the tensed language you had before, namely that when you want to build models in order to give a semantics for them, you will have to use points of evaluation. In your case, it's times. In my case, it's space-time points. So I don't see how I've imported any relativity that wasn't already there in the traditional views on time.
Well, I mean, can I still add something, or Silvia, or you?
Well, you if you want to have a quick reply, and then Sven can conclude this exchange so that Alvaro can ask his question.
Okay, okay, very quickly. But then if it doesn't go quickly, we just stop it. Okay. No, okay, but so in the traditional picture, you know, there are matter of facts concerning the points in the elsewhere, okay, that you don't have in the relativistic picture. Now, if you go with one of these traditional theory, theories, okay, in the relativistic setting, either you have that there aren't determinate matter of facts with respect to what is present or not at the points in the elsewheres, or what is present or not in the points that, or whether it's present or not is relativized to here nows. Okay.
Okay, so now maybe I understand better where you're coming from. So were you asking? So we started off thinking that there was this objective property of being present. Now we are going relativistic. What happened to that property?
Yeah, it's not objective; it's absolute. I mean, anyway, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So it's not. It's no relativization. That's sort of then. Yeah. Okay. Well, you can still have that. So there are two things. So if you start off with that, then you might either say you don't have to change your ideology, so you still think that there is this property, but only one point instantiates that. So basically, in the end, then you have to go for the pointy version of spatial presentism.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. That may be then a reason for doing it that way. But you may not need to start off that way. So not everyone is forced to express their presentism by postulating this kind of substantive absolute property. You have now given a reason for opting for one of these spatial presentism views rather than others.
Okay, I see the dialectic.
Because the story I told, the two causal interpretations I gave, they were just for the growing block. I was not pretending that they are also available to presentist or spatial presentist or whatever. Yeah. Sorry, that I should have made that clearer.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so Alvaro.
Hi. So let me ask you something. So one of the appealing things about the standard way versions of presentism or the growing block is that they have this notion of flow. So one-dimensional series of things happening, an absolute flow. And I was wondering if we move to these relativized versions, it seems that we are losing this flow, or it's just relative to some particular trajectory in space-time. So is this so? Like this flow is missing, or is it?
No,
can it be safe in some way?
No, the flow would sort of go with the different word lines, with a different trajectory. So there are different ways things can evolve depending on which turn you take, as it were, through space-time. But basically, that's what you would expect once you think that your ontology is relative to space-time points. So that there's variation across space-time, now the whole thing, space-time, in what exists. That may be unattractive for all sorts of other reasons. So again, I should emphasize that. All I wanted to do is that there were certain challenges to these views that I thought they could be handled this way. Question remains whether one should opt for any of those views, right? But yes, the idea would be that basically where you had one uniform evolution, it now fragments into these different trajectories.
Yeah, but then this uniform, so this evolution is not absolute. It's not That is something that maybe was appealing for in the classical setting.
Yeah. Now, okay. So now it comes. The question becomes how was that? Okay, that's a good point. So now it comes. The question becomes how in the original, so in the traditional setting, pre-relativistic setting, how this flow or the passage of time was being expressed, right? So it's not that people tend to say that there is this flow property, right? Like the property of being present. They express that typically, or in the end, I would say, bound to express it by just using tense operators. So right. Yeah. And now I can do the same with my spatial temporal operators. And then you will see that immediately gives you then these different passages, as it were, because then it depends really what. So it's not relative. It's not in any objectionable sense relative, because you still have for each point on any arbitrary trajectory, so you can tell a story, what exists at each of these points. That's just as objective, and then you will just say, well, okay, so there is then after this more exists than what existed before, right? So you can still say all these things. It's not as if you had sort of one monolithic property of flowiness that you then sort of all of a sudden say, well, oh yeah, but what can I do now with this in this setting, because I have all these trajectories. Still, how the ontologies change across each trajectory, that's supposed to be on this type of view just as objective. Right?
You're right. So I see it, but for me it's still like these new versions have lost the appeal that classic presentism and.
Okay. So, but let me say this. So, if the only thing I've achieved is to push people towards coming clean on why they think that these views are unattractive, then I'm already happy, because that now we can't just say, oh, because it doesn't make sense any longer, we don't have the conceptual resources to express these views. No, we can. And if they are objectionable, then let us know why. And for example, the Putnam challenge was a challenge of this kind, right? You say, well, oh, there's this intuitive principle. And then you think, well, not really. If you start off from a different departure point, you think, well, that's not really so intuitive or attractive after all. But I think that, so I'm perfectly well disposed to be convinced that we should be spatial permanentists, let's say, right?
Right.
That's fine with me.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions, remarks? No, Giuliano, did you want to add something?
So actually, there is a so what I was so there is also Christian, which is connected through Zoom through my computer. So he listened to the and he might have a follow up or a question. I think if he speaks, you can hear him. You wanna try?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Maybe speak a bit louder. Okay.
I first thank you. Sorry for this inconvenience. I tried from Meet, but it doesn't work from my laptop. So thank you. I think I have a sort of a follow-up on Giuliano's question, and maybe I have to see if, depending on what you reply. So as far as I understand, it looks like you're sort of saying that there is no problem with objectiveness, with being present, let's say, and still you want to say that the causal properties of, the causal story of certain space-time points might be relativized. Is it that more or less?
Say the last bit again, sorry.
So are you saying that the causal story given a space-time point might be relativized? So the causal story is relativized to space-time points. Is that correct?
Well, that depends now crucially on what you mean by being relativized. So for example, take the traditional context. So you have a tensed language. Everyone knows that sort of these languages allow you to articulate sentences that change their truth value with time. So that's uncontroversial. You might still think that even though that is so, whenever you use them on a given occasion, some of them at least, sort of are suitable to express truth simpliciter, just the hard facts without any relativization. So for example, if you think, as the growing blocker thinks, that what exists changes with time, namely becomes more, you're not thinking of this, oh, existence is relative. You're still thinking about all there is, that changes, not what exists at a time or something. It's sort of the quantification is unrestricted. Okay, so that means that you can still make claims, and that I think is what Giuliano was also after. You use the term present. Yes, surely, if you use it at different times, you will pick out different things falling under it. So that's just sort of the tenseness of it. But still, what you attribute when you use that term is a robust absolute property that is not further relativized. It's just that reality changes because different things have that property as time goes by. So similarly, you might tell a causal story about what is efficacious for bringing about the future. The future. I'm not saying the future of here now, of this point. I'm just saying the future. So you may have these terms that allow you then to express a property, and of course this sort of the truth value of what you say will change depending on where in space-time you're speaking. But still, wherever you use them, you want to express something that is not further relativized. So I don't think that there's any new relativity coming into play that wasn't there already. Relativity only in the sense that when you semantically evaluate tense sentences, you do that by asking yourself not what's just true at a world, but what's true at a world and a time. So similarly, here you have a spatio-temporal language. When you evaluate sentences expressed in that language, in the semantics, you will evaluate that with respect to a world, let's say, possible world, and a space-time point. So that's the only relativization. But what you're saying is still something like everywhere in the elsewhere region, blah. And you say that now, and now it's true, as blah holds everywhere in the elsewhere region. Perhaps when you move a bit further to the right, no.
Okay.
No, further up, sorry. Okay, yeah.
So maybe another way. I think I got better what you were saying. Still, there might be a way to say the point I was trying to make that is slightly different. So if suppose you believe that causal facts supervene on actual facts, a la Humean way, then it seems that in your view they don't just supervene on actual fact, but they also supervene on actual facts and on well, I don't know where you are, where the relativization to time. Is that correct? So, I mean, it's not a problem per se, but I just wonder whether a Humean would be happy with that.
Well, the Humean will not be pleased by any of this, but also not be pleased in the original growing block thing, because if you have a Humean conception of laws, for example, governing what's happening now with respect to what it will bring about, let's say, I mean, is to have a look exactly what shape the laws take. But then if you really think that they're like generalizations, and they are grounded in the instances, then you will have to posit already the future events, right? Because then, so you want to say that there's a law that connects basically what happens now with some future event. You will express that as a growing blocker, for example, say, well, it will bring about this event. Right? But if you don't think that of laws like sort of something potentially productive, I mean, non-Humean conception, if you abandon that, you think, well, no, it's just sort of what best systematizes all the mosaic of particular fact, then you will have to take into account the future facts.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Yeah, that's good for me. I'm still not entirely sure whether a union cannot be growing blocker or presentist, but I think you made a good point. So
at least I would insist that the kinds of problems that you suspect there are in the relativistic setting are of the same kind that also arise in the pre-relativistic setting.
That's right. Thank you. And thanks for the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, for being and not being here at the same time.
Yes, you know.
Are there remarks or questions from the other people?
Yeah, may I add something else? So I was thinking one of the positive things about presentism or growing block has to do with probabilities and whether the future is undetermined and it's getting a concrete possibilities visualized in the present moment, something like that. So I don't know if you have thought about this and how it relates to the new versions of presentism or new versions of the growing block.
Well, I mean, so the traditional growing block, so what does the traditional growing block theory has to offer by way of telling a story about the open future, right? What do they have to say? Well, one thing, of course, is that there is just no future. So the past is real, the present is real. So basically the past has stayed with us as far as existence is concerned, but it's not that we can already quantify over future things, right? In that sense, the future is sort of open in the sense of there is just nothing there is now nothing that is located just only in the future of now, right? So that just sort of a simple way of paraphrasing that, or sort of not very accurately, but would be to say the future is empty. And then similarly, you can find the same kind of view by looking at the four views that I've characterized. For all of them, the future light cone is empty. So is that enough? Is that enough to capture the open future? Well, I guess not. You will have to have some indeterminism in the laws, right? But then I think even the spatial permanentist or the permanentist can have that. So the existence doesn't matter. So you have a fixed ontology, including future things, or including things that populate the future light cone. That's all fine. You still want to say, well, yeah, but it's not as if what happens here in some non-metaphysical sense necessitates, or necessitates what comes later. So that these are options, and everyone has those to go indeterministic. I mean, in principle, it depends on what the science says and blah blah. But that's not a sort of distinguishing mark, let's say, amongst these views, or for these views.
I would think that the block, not growing block, the block universe version will have a more difficult time, like accommodating views that say that like probabilities are something objective and there is no real fact about the future now. So it's not until it happens. It doesn't. There is no fact out whether or not. So in that sense, I see it will have like a more difficult time to accommodate that view, but I don't know. I don't know how they want it.
Okay, so I've focused now on metaphysical views that sort of talk about what exists. When you now think about, what about facts, and what about bivalence? Is everything either true or false? What makes it so, and so forth? Then perhaps sort of just talking about existence will not do. So, I mean, Fabrice and I have a story to tell how even though there are no purely future things, as a growing blocker, you can still have bivalence for future contingents, but that's a different story. That's
Well, thank you very much, Sven. If there are no other questions or remarks, I thank you very much again for the presentation and the discussion.
Well, thank you so much for coming and for the questions.
And I hope to see you maybe in future sessions of our seminar as guests. If you want to take part in the discussions when there are the speakers, of course,
Let me know.
you're more than welcome. And our next meeting with the PROTEUS seminar series will be on the 19th of January with Matteo Morganti. We have other meetings before Christmas break for the Ancient Philosophy seminar on the 1st of December and then on the 15th of December. I don't have any particular news. I will send, of course, the program out in the next days, and you can, of course, circulate the list of the meetings that we have. It's already on the website. And I thank you all for participating today.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Sven. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Ciao Giuliano. Bye bye. Ciao.